Good afternoon, and welcome to the third in a series of online subscriber events from the Christian Science Monitor. From our Boston studios, I'm Ben Frederick, and today we've asked three of the Monitor's correspondents to try to help us understand where we're headed, a week after one of the most closely watched midterm elections in recent history. Joining us in Washington is our bureau chief, Linda Feldmann, along with congressional correspondent Francine Kiefer. And here in our Boston studios, I'm joined by Christa Case Bryant. Christa is our former political editor who is now our Heartland correspondent. And for the past year, she has been traveling across the vast swath between the coasts to provide us with a very different perspective on the issues that are shaping politics. So a little bit of housekeeping first. We are using the Zoom platform for this event, so if you're joining us by computer, you'll have the opportunity to send us any questions you might have for our guests. Simply click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen to bring up the Q&A box. You can then send us your question, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Also, you should know this program is being recorded, and if you registered, you'll get an email in the next day or so with a link to see the video again on YouTube. But let me start with a question for Linda. After months of polling and predictions, voters made the final call with their split decision in the House and Senate. Mm-hmm. Is there anything we've learned since then that might give us a hint where Washington is headed?
So I think the first thing we learned is that President Trump is maybe even a little bit out of sorts over what happened. Anybody who saw his press conference last Wednesday, the day after the midterms, where he was quite aggressive, both with the press and even belittling the Republicans who lost, naming them by name and kind of dancing on their graves. It was really a pretty bracing performance. And then, of course, he went to Paris and didn't really mesh with the other leaders there. So I think he's not too happy with the outcome, even though there was, in fact, plenty there for him to celebrate. So what I see going forward is a test of President Trump, who is, we all have to remember, is still new to politics and to governing, a test of his ability to adapt, and also a test of the Democrats in Congress, particularly in the House, where they now have the majority, to adapt to their new role now that they've gained some power and can really have a big impact on the agenda in Washington, both in terms of legislation and in terms of investigations.
Linda, I know you spent some time on Air Force One going to different rally sites in Montana, and I was there a little bit after you. Trump visited 4 times to try to support Matt Rosendale's candidacy for the Senate to oust the incumbent Jon Tester, and Tester managed to squeak through nevertheless. And I'm just curious your perspective on that. I mean, Trump seemed to really personally invest in that election, perhaps more than most of the other Senate races. What do you make of his involvement and the result?
So I think his involvement was, it was fascinating to watch, both to fly with him on Air Force One for those 2 days, and then just to watch that final week to 10 days of the campaign where he was on the road pretty much full time. I think he was very helpful in some circumstances. I think he helped the Republican ballot, the Republican candidates running for statewide office in Florida. And he could have even done more. I was just talking with a pollster, a nonpartisan pollster based in Jacksonville, Florida, which is in the north of the state. And he was surprised that Donald Trump didn't come to northern Florida. He had been to the Panhandle and, of course, had been in Southwest Florida, which is another Republican stronghold. The Montana case is fascinating. As you said, Donald Trump visited the state 4 times. He was so personally invested in defeating Jon Tester, who had played a critical role in the demise of Dr. Ronnie Jackson, who had been nominated. He was the president's personal physician. President Trump had nominated him to become the Veterans Affairs Secretary. And then Senator Tester and his office had played a role in putting out some information about Dr. Jackson that was not flattering, and ultimately led him to drop his bid to become VA Secretary. The fact that Jon Tester still won as did Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia, two Democrats in very, very red states. I think that shows, A, the power of incumbency, but also the power of just the candidates themselves. We do think of this election as having been nationalized by the president, which in many ways he did, but the candidates themselves matter deeply.
You really would have to say that Joe Manchin is Mr. West Virginia.
Right.
There's no one more West Virginia than Joe Manchin. He kept making a point out of the fact that his opponent is really from New Jersey.
Right.
So he was a governor. Mm-hmm. Tester has a long history in Montana. Quality of candidate, personality and character of candidate really matter.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
and I think turnout might have played a big role in Montana as well. I was looking at some of the numbers. I couldn't find a complete list of all of the states, but state turnout in Montana was 69% compared to a national average of 47%. And one woman I talked to, in Helena, who was working as the main volunteer for Montana Women Vote in the capital there, she said they got up to 74% in her county, Lewis and Clark County. So I don't know how much of that was driven by a Senate race or if there were more local races, or I think there was a Medicaid expansion initiative on the ballot there, but I wonder if that played a role as well.
And the other thing about Donald Trump flying around the country is that while it does activate his base of support, it also gets his opponents riled up. So Donald Trump, for example, there's some thought that President Trump's visit to Houston actually helped Beto O'Rourke. Beto O'Rourke ended up losing by fewer than 3 percentage points, which was a smaller margin than predicted. So
that was to Ted Cruz for people who don't follow Texas politics.
So the fact that Trump went to Texas to help Ted Cruz, what that did actually was bring back the narrative of Donald Trump and Ted Cruz at loggerheads during the primary, when Donald Trump was calling him Lion Ted, and they were vying against each other for the nomination. And it, I think, was maybe a reminder to some Texas voters that this endorsement by President Trump was maybe not as 100% sincere as it might appear.
Christa, I have a question for you.
Sure.
I had expected actually to be out on the campaign trail a lot earlier than I did, but Brett Kavanaugh happened, the hearings happened. So I was in Washington for 3 weeks, intensely reporting on the Kavanaugh story, when I thought that I might be, in Arizona or North Dakota or Missouri or something like that. I made it to Tennessee, and then I dipped my toe in on a House race in Virginia. But you were out and about in the heartland, and I'm just wondering what you noticed. What was the main thing? Did you have any surprises? What was your overall takeaway from your reporting in the heartland?
I mean, I think one thing that's been really great about this beat, which I've been doing for the past year, is you get out into places that don't make the news headlines all the time, and you see things that are really encouraging about where our country's at a time when it feels like there's so much doom and gloom about politics not working and Washington being deadlocked. So I was in Kentucky just the week before the election, and I was really amazed how many of the campaign signs that I saw. It was everything from, town councilor to Secretary of, or I don't remember if it was Secretary of State, but, statewide offices saying, like, on their little tiny yard signs, it'd say like bipartisan record, or, fighting for the people first, or it seemed like that had sort of become a popular thing to declare about yourself as a candidate in Kentucky. And that was surprising to me, because I knew that, the national context is very polarized, and there's been some very heated conversations in Kentucky over various things, including health care. And so to see that was something that candidates felt would help get them elected was pretty heartening to me. I think also it's just really refreshing to talk to everyday people and to hear what they're thinking about. It's not always, in fact, it's often not what's in the headlines or what Washington is talking about. And, to a certain extent, they're a lot more willing to compromise at a local level and to support candidates who might be willing to do the same thing. I mean, here in Massachusetts, I was chipping away on a story about our governor, who's a Republican, Governor Charlie Baker, and he has a completely Democratic-controlled state legislature, and yet he's so popular. He got more than 1 million votes more than Elizabeth Warren, who is, not making any secret of the fact that she's eyeing the presidential nomination in 2020, and Massachusetts is such a liberal state. And to be sure, there are definitely areas of Massachusetts, areas of the Boston metro area where he did not prevail over his Democratic candidate. But I think his record of being pragmatic and getting things done, and he turned around a big budget deficit, those things don't go unnoticed, and people are willing to, or even happy to support that kind of bipartisanship working together.
I've gotten a question from a couple of people. Just in terms of on the national scale, I think what areas kind of have the most promise for bipartisan legislation, given now that the House is flipped and the Senate's now Republican?
I think I'll take that
I think
one.
Francine, this question.
I think I'll take that one. I would say, on the largest scale, the hope from Nancy Pelosi anyway is to have an infrastructure bill. She sees that as a big jobs generator. And the president, if we remember election night 2 years ago, one of the things he talked about was infrastructure. He's a guy who's been around the world, been in all these great airports compared to our not so great airports, fast trains around the world, broadband everywhere. He's very familiar, actually, through his work in real estate development of how important infrastructure is to the economy. So I think there could be potential for working together on this if Democrats could tolerate the sight of the president signing a bill that they were also on. The more the polarization happens, the bigger the question is, do they want the other guy to get a win? It has to be a clear win-win for both sides. So I think infrastructure is one place where they could work together. Another area where they could work together is on healthcare costs. Bringing down the price of prescription drugs, the president is already considering that issue, and that's something that Democrats also want to do. What makes it an advantage is it's kind of a narrow area that they can work on, as opposed to let's overhaul and fix Obamacare. That's not going to happen. But they might be able to do a small deal on reducing the cost of prescription drugs. So those are two areas. And if you get a little bit further afield, the Higher Education Act is coming along. That supposedly is a place where they might be able to work together. So there are a few areas, but I think the watchword or the balancing act for House Democrats is, okay, finding common ground, but investigate. They want to take back and reclaim the powers of Congress as an equal branch, which may seem to be bludgeoning the president, but I also have to say, every Congress has let the executive branch take more and more power. We saw it in the past one, we saw it in the one before then. So they're going to have to balance how much check they want of check and balance.
I think that's such a good point about infrastructure, Francine. I mean, in all my travels, I think I've been to 11 states now, some of them twice, and, bumping along highways in the late at night after a long day of reporting, you sure notice how bad America's roads have gotten. And one of those places was Wisconsin. And Tony Evers, the superintendent of schools in the state who just beat Scott Walker, that was one of his main things. He said our roads are horrible after how many years was it that Walker was there? 8, 10?
Yeah.
Long time. Anyway, that was a major complaint and something so many people mentioned to me when I was there, and I definitely noticed it myself. Also, I was in Oklahoma, and this was one of my favorite stories I worked on this year, and it's not political per se, but it's an example of how fixing infrastructure can really help a community. There's a rural water district there where some people still don't even have their own running water, and the infrastructure that exists is pretty old. I think it was about 80 years old, and this man who had formerly been a truck driver and somehow got put in charge of running the rural water district discovered that something like 50% of his water was just flowing out of the pipes every week, every month. And he decided to start trying to figure out where it was coming out. So in the middle of the night when, very few people are taking showers or, running their dishwasher or whatever, he would go and just put his ear down to like 700 miles of pipes, at different points along the piping system and try to figure out, because if he could hear water rushing, then he knew it was rushing out. It was probably rushing out a hole. And then he would use that to figure out and pinpoint where the holes were. So he mapped his whole system, figured out where the problems were, and he got it down to just 15%. And, that's a not very well-funded rural water district in the middle of Oklahoma. And when I was researching that story, though, I discovered what a huge problem that is all across America. On our infrastructure report card, I think we got a D+ as a country on our water infrastructure, and we're losing so much water every day. It's enough to supply 15 million households, which is like multiple cities worth of homes. So I think it could be a huge win. I mean, who wants leaky pipes? Like, that doesn't need to be a partisan issue.
The issue with everything in Congress is how to fund it. Right. And we're already at $1 trillion deficits. Mm-hmm. So we'll just have to see what happens with the funding. But no one denies. And both sides have been behind infrastructure for ages. And the question is always how to fund it.
Yeah. Okay, Ben, you probably have more questions.
Yeah, I do. I guess, Linda, I'm curious, is the significant win for Republicans in the Senate, is that a foreshadowing of what's to come in the presidential election that's going to start to unfold in the coming months?
So not necessarily. This was an unusual election in that, so every House seat is up every 2 years, but in the Senate, only 1/3 of the seats are up. And in the cycle we just had, it was the map, the playing field was tilted heavily in favor of the Republican Party. You had 10 seats up for election that were held by Democrats in states that were won by Donald Trump. So the fact that it's looking like the Democrats are going to lose only a net of 2 seats is actually extraordinary. The Republicans could have won many more seats. They could have beaten many more of those incumbents like John Tester and Joe Manchin. And we just learned last night that Kyrsten Sinema won in Arizona. That's another pickup for the Democrats. So as I said, and assuming that the result in Florida holds with Governor Scott winning that Senate seat, then I think we're going to have a net gain of 2 Republicans. But going forward to the 2020 election, it's a completely different map, and the dynamic is reversed. You have many more Republicans up for re-election in 2020 than Democrats. So you're going to have the higher turnout from a presidential race, and the real referendum on Donald Trump, not the quasi-referendum that we just had. So I think it'll be a bit of a different dynamic than we just saw.
Mm-hmm. And we also got an interesting question from Ray in Tucson. He was wondering, he was sort of comparing the midterms, this set of midterms to Clinton's midterms and Obama's midterms, and noting that they, both Democratic presidencies lost a lot more midterm seats in the House, and that Trump did better than them. And so I'm just curious if you could sort of comment on that a little bit. How did he do?
Sure. Well, it is true, as Ray points out, that President Trump did much better than both Obama, remember that shellacking comment, and Clinton. But on the other hand, he did worse than President Reagan, and he did worse than President Bush. Now, Bush had the Iraq War behind him in his first midterm, but then the next year, he lost seats. The next election, he lost seats. And Trump did worse than both those 2 presidents. And when I talked to kind of a commentator who watches these kinds of things, how to size it up afterwards, he said, well, the president did kind of average. And just to explain to readers a little bit about some of the verbiage that actually gets into a Monitor story, when I was writing that election results story on Wednesday, we didn't actually know the full election results, and we still don't know the full election. There are 10 House seats still outstanding, and we have these 2 Senate races that have not been decided yet. So I did not characterize it in any way. I didn't say, oh, this is a wave. I actually didn't even list the numbers because they are so in flux. I was sticking with what are the broad themes going on here. And the main news, of course, was that the House was flipped to Democrats. And that was the theme that I explored in my story. So 2 or 3 or 4 days or a week later, we can, in retrospect, compare all the numbers, but that was something I needed to avoid on the day I actually wrote the results story, because we didn't know all of them. And I just was careful not to characterize it in any way, just to explore the main theme at hand.
I think part of Ray's question, which I appreciated because I actually wasn't aware of those numbers, and I think Francine portrayed them very accurately. But compared to Clinton and Obama, Trump did do significantly better. Like Obama lost 63 seats in 2010, and Trump is in the mid 30s somewhere. But I felt like a deeper part of his question was, how come you guys never give Trump credit for anything? And I hear that when I go all over the country, and I'm always, even though I am trying really hard to be fair, I am always struck by how different people perceive things in a place like West Virginia or Kentucky or where else have I been? Nebraska, Oklahoma, than here in Boston. And I mean, that shouldn't be a surprise. I know that it's going to be different. It just always strikes me that it's even bigger than I remembered from the last time. And I think that's part of why we decided to add this post. And we also added somebody in Texas after the 2016 election, because like a lot of media outlets, we realized, we're missing some key perspectives here. We're missing things. That's why we didn't see Trump's victory coming, like a lot of people didn't. And so I think that's really helpful, and to have people on the ground to see those things. And I know Francine, Linda, and I all try very hard to be fair in our reporting, both from, what topics we choose to how we cover those to who we talk to make sure that we're getting a range of opinions. But it's a challenge for sure. I don't know if either of you want to add anything to that.
I wanted to point out something else about this congressional race, and that is that that the Republican Party in the House faced record retirements.
Yes.
Incumbent members of Congress have a huge advantage. The voters know them. They have a record. It's, for example, in South Florida, where I spent a week in late September, there was a seat in Miami being vacated by Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, the first Cuban American elected to Congress, the first Latina elected to Congress. After many, many years, she finally decided to retire. It was a seat that by the end had been controlled, was a very Democratic district. That district had been won by Hillary Clinton by 20 points, and yet Ros-Lehtinen had won re-election as a Republican. So when she decided to retire, that pretty much handed that seat to the Democrats. There are other examples of that. That might be the most extreme example. But so Donald Trump lost a lot of ground in terms of his Democratic majority in the House when he saw so many retirements. And in fact, a Republican friend of mine said that some of those members, if they could have made that decision over again, might not have decided to retire when they saw what a challenge President Trump was facing in holding on to the House.
That's interesting. We've seen a large number of more diverse candidates, more women, younger folks, that kind of thing, coming into the House in this this latest election. And one question we have is, any thoughts on, is that going to actually, do we think that's going to increase sort of pragmatism, or is that going to be even more chaotic, or what does that influx of sort of new blood bring?
It's really hard to generalize on that, because not all women are alike and not all men are alike. Let's just remember that. Mm-hmm. But when I do talk to women members on the Hill, and when I talked to, say, Abigail Spanberger in that Virginia district where she won her race, I actually was a little surprised that she won, because that was a steep climb for her, where she won her race, and you ask them about the difference that women make, it's less about legislation and it's more about tone and collaboration. And to the one, almost every woman lawmaker I talk to says they feel that women have a more collaborative demeanor about them and are a bit less combative. So I'm wondering if there's going to be a change in the tone. And then presuming that Nancy Pelosi becomes Speaker, you are going to have there an advocate for family type issues, as well as a very competent negotiator and fighter. She really knows her legislative chops and is a very hard bargain driver. So, it's just hard to generalize about these issues, but I would say mostly when you talk to women candidates themselves, they're running on security, national security, the economy. They're not picking out special issues. And they describe themselves as collaborators, and that could make a difference in the tone.
And I think it's worth noting Spanberger is one of, 20 candidates in the congressional races who made it through the primaries who were being mentored by Seth Moulton. He's an Iraq War veteran. He served 4 tours of duty over there, and he has made a pretty gutsy public push for new leadership in the House. He's been very vocal that he doesn't think Pelosi should be running things anymore. She's in her late 70s, like a number of other top Democratic figures. So he's said, we need a new kind of leader. We need people who are willing to work with the other side and to put country above party and to put people above politics. I spent a day with Seth and one of his mentees in Kentucky the week before the election. Her name is Amy McGrath, and she had been a Marine aviator and served in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I think 89 bombing missions against al-Qaeda in Iraq. And she was telling me about, I was sort of asking her, how Representative Moulton had helped her and why she felt this was important to put country first. And she told me about a colleague of hers when she was based in Helmand province in Afghanistan, which was a Taliban stronghold. And his call sign was Sugar Bear, and he was one of her close friends there. And he was a Republican, she's a Democrat, and they used to get in pretty vigorous conversations about different political ideas. But she said, at the end of the day, I knew that we just loved our country and we were patriots first, and politics came after that. And one day he went out for a mission and was shot down and didn't come back. And when she was talking about that, she talked about, what an impact that made on her and how much it made her as a prospective congresswoman want to make sure that she never forgets what people have sacrificed for the country, and that you remember that we're all in this together. Like, the enemy is not the other political party, the enemy is, all sorts of different things, whether it's the Taliban or the national debt or whatever, but we're all in this together as a country. And I think of those 20 candidates who were part of Representative Moulton's network, I think 17 of them got elected, and Spanberger was one of them in a very close race. Another one of his mentees was Connor Lamb in Pennsylvania, who really surprised people when he won there earlier this year. So it was encouraging to see that candidates running that type of campaign with that sort of message were so successful.
I might just do a quick PS on your comment, which is, before the election, so much were made about the splits within the Democratic Party, the Bernie wing versus the Hillary Clinton establishment wing, and, newcomers who have popped up from the progressive side who are going to be in the new Congress. But, a lot of the people who are coming on the Democratic side are from swing districts who ran on the message of, I am going to reach across the aisle. I want to work with Republicans. So that is what we need to watch for, what will happen with those people. And I actually think that the split within the Democratic Party, or the pressures, will come much more from the outside than within the Democratic caucus itself. I mean, we'll see whether I'm right about that, but you're going to have Tom Steyer out there pressing for impeachment. And
he's doing a press conference tomorrow, by the way, in Washington.
Not surprised. And I think it's going to be more cohesive within the Democratic caucus than from outside.
And what do you see happening with the Republicans?
I think, they are going to learn very quickly the pain of being in the minority. You're basically, in the House, you're basically nobody. It's ruled by majority.
Right.
And basically, the Democrats are going to control everything. And I hate to say it, but I've been on the Hill now for 5 years. I'm only one person. I have to pick my shots of where I can go for things. And honestly, I just have not paid too much attention to the Democratic Party for the last 5 years in the House because they don't have any power. And Republicans are going to find out very quickly what it's like to be in the minority. It's not a pleasant thing.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting in President Trump's press conference last week. He said he sort of justified in his own mind why it may be a good thing that the Democrats retook the House. I mean, obviously, nobody wants to lose. So his party lost control of the House. But he said, look what would have happened if the Republicans had held on to the House by just a few votes. He said, there's always a few who will stray and who will vote against you. So he's learned that. And that, I think in a way, there's a way to rationalize and feel okay about losing the House. It's like, okay, Democrats, let's show us what you got. Now you have skin in the game. You're not just sitting on the outside, lobbing grenades into the tent. Now you're inside the tent too, and have to show what you can do. And the 2020 election has already started, and everybody needs to show that they can accomplish something. Both parties do, the Democrats and the Republicans. And whether they can do that, I don't know. But if we get to 2020 and they've literally gotten nothing done, I mean, maybe they can barely keep the government open, and that's actually the lame duck could be interesting in that regard. So it's going to be a real tussle between scoring political points in advance of the 2020 election and actually getting things done.
We had a question from David in Kansas about governorships that I think ties in well with this, because the Republicans have been focusing so much on state-level elections sort of as a strategy. The Democrats actually took back a few governorships, especially in the Midwest, in the Kansas in particular, I think is where David is from. Mm-hmm. And so he was just, he was interested to hear y'all's thoughts on that reversal.
No, that was fascinating. And that was, the Democrats retaking the House was the big headline of the night a week ago. But the Democrats taking over 7 governorships, I think that was a record for the Democrats to take that many governorships in one election. And that is absolutely huge, especially when you look at which states they took. Not only Kansas, which as Tom Perez, the Democratic chairman, called beat red Kansas. That was incredible to take Kansas, but also the Democrats finally knocked off Scott Walker after 3 elections. He had won 2 general elections and a recall vote. So they finally got Wisconsin back, and then you have Michigan, and of course they won re-election in Pennsylvania. So that gives you back the blue wall, or at least the potential for the blue wall to be re-erected for the 2020 election. Those are the 3 upper Midwestern states that Donald Trump had won in 2016, and which gave him the election. This pollster I was just speaking with, who's in Florida, was saying that he thinks that Florida will be absolutely a must-win for Donald Trump in 2020, because he thinks Donald Trump cannot duplicate the feat of winning Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin in 2020. And so Florida, believe it or not, becomes even more important in 2 years. And I would guess, my prediction, I know we're in a recount in Florida, but I do think that the Republican Ron DeSantis will win that race. And that's good news for Donald Trump, because having the governorship in the biggest battleground state in the country is a huge asset for the president.
So Linda, can I just ask you,
Sure.
The fact that Democrats won governorships in those Midwest states, does that change the electoral college advantage that the president has had? Because the kind of conventional wisdom was, well, the way things work, the middle is getting redder, and Trump won on the electoral college, and those populations are still kind of the same. So we can just count on the electoral college. So does that mean that upset that a little bit in terms of where Republicans are at for 2020?
Well, in every state, as you're heading into an election year and a census year, so 2020 is the next decennial census, you want to have as much power in those states, the Republicans or the Democrats, as you possibly can, because that affects redistricting. And yes, it allows the infrastructure of one party or the other to come to bear during that election, including the presidential race. So I don't know what's going to happen to the electoral college votes. Some of the northern states are probably going to lose electoral college votes as the American population shifts southward. But I'd say just for starters, that you just want to have as much power as you possibly can heading into a presidential race and a census year.
But Linda or Francine, would you interpret these results as saying, each one of these 7 states where Dems took the governorship again means that it's flipping to more Democrat? Because I know, like in Montana, for example, Trump won there by 20 percentage points in 2016, and yet they have a very popular Democratic governor. And,
Right.
going back to Charlie Baker here in Massachusetts, the opposite is true. So just wondering how you interpret sort of the mood, or is it just maybe not so much about do people want Democrats or do they want Republicans as do they want someone moderate versus someone who's a real ideologue. I mean, in Kansas,
Right,
Chris Kobach, was very dedicated to his views and had deep convictions and fought really hard for them. I was at the voter ID trial where he was representing himself, and it was a very charged trial. There were a lot of journalists from all over the country there, and I just wonder how much that played into Laura's win in Kansas as a Democrat.
Absolutely. No, I think with governorships, the people involved are really, really important. It often is a vote. People are voting for the candidate and not necessarily the party. And as you see in Massachusetts and nearby here in Maryland, where we also have a Republican governor in Democratic Maryland, states are, I think, often more willing to elect a governor from the party that doesn't win that state in presidential elections because they like that particular person. They think he or she will do a good job in their state. And also, because they're their governor and they're not being sent to Washington, they can kind of keep an eye on them. And even though they belong to the party that isn't the dominant party of the state, they could say, well, that Steve Bullock in Montana is my kind of Democrat. He's all about doing the best for the state of Montana, and his Democratic identity is less important than who he is personally and what he believes in.
I'm going to take this moment just to shamelessly plug our politics newsletter. If you enjoy this kind of discussion, we really invite you to subscribe to the free newsletter that we put out every Wednesday. You can find it on csmonitor.com/newsletters. And you'll get insights from our Washington bureau with Francine and Linda, as well as stuff from our correspondents throughout the U.S., including Christa. So please subscribe to that.
Let me put in a plug for Liz Marlantis, who's she's our political editor, and she's fantastic, and as was Christa. And Liz writes a little analysis every week on a relevant topic in that newsletter. So that's a little added value to subscribers.
And then back to questions from readers. Here's a good, interesting one from David McClurkin. The burden to work across the aisle falls heavier on the minority. This goes back to something we were talking about earlier with the changing of the guard in the House. Doesn't the 2020 election make that very troublesome, given the loyalty to Trump at any cost dynamic for Republicans?
I'm actually not quite sure that I understood the question. But I think what you're asking about, sorry about that, David, we talk on Twitter with each other. The minority party, yes, they have to be reaching across. But what 2020 is going to be doing in terms of affecting this dynamic on the Democratic side, in the Senate anyway, you're going to have all those presidential hopefuls up there, grandstanding, pushing Schumer, pushing him to resist or not go along. And you might have the same thing on the House side as well. So they're more like than 35 candidates now that people are talking about on the Democratic side. It's just a huge field. And that's where you're going to feel pressure to not cooperate, especially from the progressive wing of the party.
And speaking of the sort of the huge number of candidates, Brian in San Francisco was wondering about sort of anything the panel chooses to offer on the subject of a $1 billion runaway campaign spending. And he gave us a helpful visual of some increases in outside spending since 1990. Are we seeing that at the local level as well as the national level, or what's happening there?
I mean, I think a lot of that extra spending in the chart is kind of like exponential growth since mainly due to Citizens United, which was a Supreme Court case in 2010 that allowed corporations to give unlimited amounts for the purpose of political campaigns. They're not allowed to give directly to political campaigns, but that sort of opened the door for a much more money to flow into the whole system. And I haven't seen studies on how that's affected the number of people running. I think a lot of it goes to ads, the flyers you get in the mail, the things you see on TV. And I think that's a lot of where it's coming from. And that's probably just going to keep going up. So I was noticing this year, actually more money was spent on the midterms than in the presidential election in 2012, which is pretty extraordinary because normally spending in a presidential election year is much higher than in the midterms. So we'll see what happens in 2020.
And is that, this is just a question from me, is that in an effort to influence electoral college and being able to redistrict and that kind of thing during this in the census year and that kind of thing? Or
you mean why is it higher in presidential years?
Why is it higher this year rather than in presidential years?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, it's continuing a trend, so I'm not sure why exactly. Maybe Francine and Linda have some insight into that.
I think Citizens United has just unleashed this burst of outside spending. I mean, and you have people like Tom Steyer and Michael Bloomberg and George Soros on the Democratic side, just opening up their wallets and spending their own money in the name of political activism, not in donations to individual candidates, but starting their own groups to push their issues. So Tom Steyer is pushing for impeachment, but also promoting voter registration and turnout among young and minority voters. You've got Michael Bloomberg on guns. On the Republican side, you have the Koch brothers with their big spending. So a lot of the money is moving away from the parties. So, for example, the Democratic National Committee was outspent 2-1 by the Republican National Committee in this election. But of course, the Democrats did really well. Part of it was that the DNC had so many problems in the last election. You know, the sort of the scandal within the party and the resignation of Debbie Wasserman Schultz as party chair. So people were reluctant to give to a party that was disorganized, and it kind of had the thumb on the scale for Hillary Clinton in 2016. So I think you also saw donors giving not just to individual candidates, but also just giving around the country. It's become very, very easy if you're sitting in a safe district, say in Massachusetts, but you want to play a role in the election, you can look around the country and see who you want to give to. And there's a platform called Act Blue that makes it very easy for Democrats to give across the board to lots of candidates. The Republicans are actually kind of jealous because they don't have that one-stop shopping platform. They're looking at trying to kind of duplicate that platform. You also have the party committees. You have the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, which focuses on House races. You have the same thing on the Republican side, and also with the 2 Senate committees for each party. So there are lots of ways for donors to give. And with the really pitched battle for control of the House and Senate, that I think really, and the people feeling very strongly about Donald Trump, either pro or con, I think that just really amped up the donations.
And I think there are a lot of concerns around that, particularly on the Democratic side. I worked on a campaign finance story when I was in Montana. Montana has some of the strictest rules when it comes to campaign finance, and it has a special body that it created where they have just one commissioner who's in charge of deciding whether you follow the rules or not, and he has a lot of power compared to other states. And Governor Bullock has been very active as well. And I think there's a lot of scrutiny there about where is all this money coming from, and like, can we tell where it's coming from? And if I get a flyer in the mail, like, do I know who's behind that and what their real agenda is? And so there's a lot of effort in Montana to improve that situation. There's also a lawyer I spoke with who's part of a firm called the BOP Law Firm, and they were the ones who successfully prosecuted Citizens United. They feel very strongly that this is a First Amendment right, and the Supreme Court agreed with them on that, basically spending money is a way of expressing your viewpoint, and that shouldn't be limited under the First Amendment. But I think something really worth noting is up until July, if a company gave, there are certain kind of groups, they're called social welfare groups, and you can give unlimited amounts to them and nobody will know that you gave. So, if you're a high profile executive and you don't want your whole company or all your customers to know what your politics are, you could give to a group like that and your name will never be published. But up until July, the IRS would know who the donors were, and Trump reversed that. I don't know how much that's on people's radar. I just found out about it when I was in Montana, and that's something that the governor of Montana has sued the IRS over because he feels it's important for there to be disclosure, at least to the government, so that it's not like, a group of Russians who are spending tons of money on Facebook ads or something. So that's something I'd love to look into more.
Going back to, and this might be a tough one to answer, but I think it's an interesting question to ask. Going back to talking about Florida having a Republican governor and that being somewhat helpful during the next presidential race, they also passed a law, I think, in this latest round where they over 1 million convicted felons would have the right to vote in the next election.
Right. Yeah, that's a really interesting aspect of the next election. So the amendment that was passed in Florida by over 60%, amendment to the state constitution, restores voting rights to convicted nonviolent felons, so not murderers, not rapists, who have served their terms. And that is 1.4 million people. That is a population that is disproportionately minority. And so the question might be whether this could give an edge to the Democrats in 2020. Again, I asked my Florida pollster about this just a little while ago, and he actually wasn't sure. He said he thinks that with a lot of people who are ex-cons, it's difficult to work your way back into a normal life after serving for a felony conviction. And he suspects a lot of these people will not have their mind on voting, which can maybe seem a little esoteric. They're more focused on just getting their lives in order. But it definitely bears watching. I mean, Florida, as we have just learned again, is a 50-50 state. I mean, it is split right down the middle. And my friend the pollster thinks we'll see the same thing in 2 years. And so I think, Florida over most other states will be right in our sights as we get ready for 2020.
Could I just add to that? When I was in Ohio this spring, I met several felons, and certainly can't say that they're representative of everybody, but I was just really, really impressed with how dedicated they were. I mean, they wanted to be good citizens so much more badly than a lot of regular people that I meet, because they know what it's like to be out of society and to mess up your life, and they were just so determined to get back on track and were doing really well. One of them had gotten involved. I mean, it was basically the opioid crisis that ruined his life and landed him in jail, or led to a sequence of events that landed him in jail. And this woman who I mentioned earlier, who was working in Helena trying to get everybody she could registered to vote, she mentioned, she would talk to some people and say, hey, are you registered to vote? And they said, no, I'm a felon. And I think in Montana, you actually are allowed to register. And so she would talk with them, and they were just so sincere and really receptive to her encouraging them. So I know it can sound like maybe that's not the best idea, but I've just been really impressed with the idea that someone who's starting their life over can be thinking about the country in a really positive and supportive way.
We had another question, sort of going back in a in a meta way. Can you guys talk a little bit about sort of the difficulty of being a political reporter in this climate?
Well, I was one of my favorite stories this spring. I was in West Virginia, the same trip when I went to Ohio, and actually Linda last minute asked me to go do some reporting on a controversial Senate candidate, and he had been a big mining executive, and under his watch there had been a huge mining accident in a small town in West Virginia. And so I decided, you know what, it's not that much out of my way to stop in this town on the way to the campaign event. So I went there. I didn't know anybody. I didn't know anything. I just learned about it that morning. And I stopped to get a sandwich, which was anyway, that's a separate story. There's no food in West Virginia. It's just fast food. I mean, in this part of West Virginia, I understood what a food desert was. But anyway, I got a sandwich, and I asked the lady, where do people here hang out in town? She said, well, the auto garage. So I went to the auto garage. Bad opening line. I said, hi, I'm Christa. I'm a journalist from Boston. That's the worst possible way to introduce yourself, because, there's a lot of skepticism, and I understand why, about people who come from liberal East Coast cities with the media to find out what's happening in West Virginia. And there's a lot of feeling that, we like go find the people who have the least teeth and, the worst accent and then like hold them up as an example of, this is how all West Virginians look and think. And so normally I try to be a little bit more approachable than that. But I guess I was just like I need to get this story in the next hour and then go down to the campaign event. But anyway, I started talking with these guys on the porch. And at first, there's like a long pause. They didn't want to answer any of my questions, but we got going. And one of them started being like, "Are you with the FBI?" I said, no, I'm a journalist. And then we talked another 5 minutes. "Are you with the DEA?" He just like went through all of these government agencies and he seemed very skeptical about who I was and what I was doing. And I was taking notes and everything, hearing about what had happened when there was a mining accident and how that was perceived and what they thought of this Senate candidate and what their experience had been with him and everything. Well, they just warmed up so much. By the end, they were like, "Hey, we have extra apartments in that building over there. Like, you should come stay here for a longer time period and learn what it's really like here. And we'll make you eat possum, it's like teach you how to talk right, and they were so great. Anyway, it turned out this guy who I'd been talking to the whole time was giving me such a hard time was the mayor of the town. And he said he hadn't given a single interview to anybody since that accident had happened. But he was like, you call anytime. I'm happy to help. Thank you for coming and listening. And so that was just a really nice turnaround. So, I mean, what I've found is that sometimes people can initially be resistant and I think they just want to know that you're fair and that you're respectful and that you're not there to caricature them. You're not there with an agenda. I had another woman it was a Donald Trump Jr. rally in Montana. And I was asking for Francine. Oh, no, it wasn't Francine. Someone else was working on a story about the Kavanaugh hearings. And I hadn't been following them very closely because I was working like 15 hours a day on other stuff, And so I asked her some questions about Kavanaugh. And she was like, "You don't even know what the charges are, do you?" Because I didn't have like all my ducks in a row exactly. She's like, "You're just here with an agenda." And I said, no, I'm not. I'm actually just like this isn't my full-time beat covering Congress. I'm out here in Montana covering the things that matter to you in Montana. And I don't have an agenda. It really matters to me to be fair and objective. Anyway, I had a little conversation with her. She was like, "Will you please accept my sincerest apologies?" I mean, it was a really nice conversation. And I took away from that, okay, even if I'm just helping someone else for a story, I should be really clear on the details and the facts of the case, even if it means staying up till 2 a.m. instead of 1 a.m. or whatever, And at the same time, like if someone confronts you like that, you can explain where you're coming from. And I've found most people to respond very positively to that. So it is a challenging time, but people are also just yearning to be taken seriously and to be treated fairly. And when you show that to them, they're very receptive.
And I would also add, I've been to a lot of Donald Trump Make America Great Again rallies. And, when I'm traveling with the president, I don't really get to talk to the people who are attending because I'm in that little presidential bubble. But I've been to MAGA rallies with Trump is there on stage, but I'm not traveling with him. And a lot of people chant along with him negative messages toward the press. But when I talk to them one-on-one, they're wonderful. They're happy to talk. They want to be heard. And I'm happy to listen. And I know Christa and Francine are as well.
Yeah. I thought I might mention a couple other aspects of this story. Since fairness and fake media, they're just such huge, overwhelming aspects of the political climate in which we live right now. I have found that it helps to explain the Monitor, explain its history, explain the time in which we were founded, that fairness and balance are just huge priorities for me. I keep them front and center when I talk with people. And then also, I promise to send them a link to my story afterward, whether I quote them or not, and they can judge for themselves how I've been. I find that little contract when you're talking with someone really helps break down that perception of the media. And I also want to explain some real practical hurdles in covering this year's campaign. I'll go back to the Spanberger race against Dave Bratt, a Republican, a Tea Party Republican. On the weekend, which was Labor Day weekend that I set up to go down them, I called, I emailed, I texted the press secretary of the Dave Bratt campaign. Answer came there, none. Multiple tries to talk. Nothing happened. I was in touch with the Spanberger campaign. They're the ones on the offense. They're the ones trying to kick out the incumbent. Oh, yeah. Within 2 hours, the Spanberger press guy was back to me and was holding my hand the entire time while I was down there. Well, of course, I felt obligated to be, for fairness reasons, I wanted to touch base with the Brat campaign. And my calls went unanswered. So I got on their website and I looked at the physical address of the campaign headquarters, and I went to the campaign headquarters and presented myself, and ended up talking to his former chief of staff, which was great. But I still wanted to talk to the candidate himself. And I did catch him in the halls of Congress the next weekend. I just caught up with him and we had a nice walk and talk through the hallway. But one of the points that he said was, the media he went into a very long tirade on the media. And then he talked about his town halls. And he said, is it any wonder that I'm not holding town halls right now when I get resistance people who come in and just yell and scream and don't want to have a productive town hall session? And I'm thinking back to a year ago when at that charity baseball game, a mass shooter was there and practically killed Steve Scalise. So there's some real structural issues of concern about how the opposition is going to act, concern about their safety, that have made actually reaching some of these candidates really difficult. And not all of them even put their addresses on their web pages.
Yeah, I had a real adventure.
Right.
I had a real adventure trying to track down the Matt Rosendale, who is challenging Tester in the Montana Senate race. I even went to his office because he works for the state government, and they told me, sorry, we're not allowed to tell you anything about his campaign because we're only here to talk about his state job. I said, well, could I at least talk with his assistant? They were like, well, maybe we can call her and she can come downstairs and talk to you outside, but she wasn't at her desk, so we couldn't do. I mean, that was like the 12th time I'd tried to reach him through various different means. So I finally caught up with his spokesperson at the rally. But
there are laws against blending government work and politics. So I had that in Pennsylvania as well. I had to talking to a state legislator in his local office. We stepped outside. He was very strict about following the rules.
Well, suffice it to say, Monitor reporters are out there trying to build trust with their sources, explaining who we are and what we do, and also having to be very creative about tracking down some of these lawmakers on both sides, I have to say, in order to get the other side of the story.
Yeah, the shoe leather bill is really high. All right. Well, that wraps up this special online event from the Christian Science Monitor. Thanks very much to our Washington Bureau Chief, Linda Feldmann, and Congressional correspondent, Francine Kiefer, who both joined us from our Washington Bureau. Thanks also to Christa Case Bryant, our former political editor for the Monitor and now our Heartland correspondent. If you subscribed to this online event, we'll be sending out a follow-up email about where and when you can view a video replay of this event on YouTube. And if you enjoyed this event or have questions, please do email us at events@csmonitor.com. That's events@csmonitor.com. And also, please subscribe to our weekly politics newsletter at csmonitor.com/newsletters. This live online event was produced by Greg Fitzgerald with technical support from Morgan Anderson, Ian Blackier, and Tim Malone. Bailey Bischoff was our production coordinator in Washington. And thanks so much for joining us. I'm Ben Frederick, and this program was a production of the Christian Science Monitor.